and welcome to today's session entitled Creating Local Cross-Sector Collaborations. My name is Jennifer Brown-Lerner, and I serve as the Deputy Director for the Aspen Institute Sports and Society program, the home to Project Play. A few housekeeping things before we get started. We are using the Slido integration on your screen, both for you to submit questions that will come to me as the moderator, as well as for you to share ideas, which are resources that you'll hear mentioned today, along with resources of your own that you want the audience to know about. We encourage you to engage as much as you can. So let's get us started. As you know, Project Play's framework, the 8 Plays for the 8 sectors, recognizes that the sports sector alone cannot achieve our goals of access, equity, and inclusion. We've got to get others involved if we want to create quality sport opportunities for each and every young person. We know we've got to get families involved, but we also need to consider schools, health organizations, business and industry, tech and media, and policymakers. Today's conversation is going to dive into that, as well as talk about how to build a coalition, forms of governance, and strategies for advocating for shared interest. Before we get started, I wanted to mention some Project Play tools that could be useful to you in your community. Our teamwork toolkit, found at teamworktoolkit.projectplay.org, is a great way for you to assess the folks involved in different sectors in your community, as well as look up some specific data about sport opportunities with your own community. I encourage you to check it out. So today's conversation will have 4 panelists from communities with different structures around their cross-sector collaboration. I'm going to invite each of them into the conversation individually to talk a little bit about their community and their work. First, I'm going to ask Ben from Laureus USA. Sorry, my notes are at the end of the page and I can't read them. To talk a little bit about Laureus and the Sport for Good cities.
Hi, how are you doing? Hi everybody, my name is Ben Charnack. I'm the Chicago Program Officer for Laureus USA. If you're not familiar with the Laureus USA and the Laureus Sport for Good Foundation, we're an international foundation that was founded under the patronage of Nelson Mandela and his belief and all of our beliefs in the power that sport has. Here in the United States, we seek to improve the lives of youth and unite communities through the power of sport, and do that through a combination of grant making and place-based work. And so the Sport for Good City initiative is really the backbone of a lot of our work, and it comes from the belief that solutions to systemic issues can't be created with a top-down approach. It requires community input, and it requires communities to actually have decision-making power, resources, funding, to drive the things that they deem most important in their communities. We launched this program in 2014 in New Orleans. At that time, it was called Model City New Orleans. And the program has since expanded within the United States to Atlanta, New York, and Chicago, and internationally to London, New Delhi, Paris, and Hong Kong. It's really become the bedrock of the way that we do the work. And even this week, it was just featured by the World Health Organization as one of the most innovative solutions for public health. I work in Chicago. I was part of our team that started up the New York program and the Chicago program. And here we have a coalition of more than 80 local organizations that collectively represent more than 80,000 young people across the city, which is more than 20% of the youth population. That gives us a huge opportunity to work collaboratively, to work with city agencies and government partners, as well as across other sectors and universities, to improve the lives of youth through sport. We think that it's an underutilized tool. We think it's overlooked as a solution within our city. And we've worked on quite a few initiatives, advocacy, trainings, capacity buildings to improve the state of play here in Chicago. So I'll talk more about that later, but it's good to be with you.
Thanks, Ben. Next, I'm going to invite Quinton Prince of the Milwaukee Youth Sports Alliance, which is commonly known as MISA. Quinton, MISA is a relatively new organization launched in the past 2 years. Tell us how the organization was started and what goals brought your leadership together.
Awesome. Great. Happy to be here with you all. So like many cities across the country, Milwaukee has some issues, and Milwaukee's been labeled a number of things throughout the years. But in an effort to continually address these issues and find solutions, we had a number of individuals and organizations representing various sectors like the business community, sports, nonprofit, public service sectors come together for a series of community discussions, and we called those discussions On the Table. So these discussions were designed to call out the issues that plague our city, but in a constructive manner, and address them head on. And so one of these discussions or sessions was focused on the youth in our city and the trauma that they experience by living in communities embattled by the effects of extreme poverty. And so the discussion uncovered a common desire for youth sports organizations to share best practices, obtain training and education in social emotional learning, and trauma-informed program design, and collaborate more closely to benefit the youth in Milwaukee. And so what we essentially did is we detailed what the landscape of the youth sports sector, what it looked like. We identified some challenges and began to like formulate solutions. And so this was what the start of what we now know as the MKE Youth Sports Alliance, or MISA. And so MISA reaches a broad range of youth sports organizations in two different capacities. So one as an intermediary, and then the other as a backbone organization. And so as an intermediary organization, we support the services of organizations rather than directly providing services to youth. We focus on building capacity and offering technical assistance. But then as a backbone organization, we serve as the coordinating body that brings together a diverse group of stakeholders to lead an effort for a common goal of making high quality youth sports offerings accessible for all Milwaukee youth. And so our main goals for the organization are to, one, unite the youth sports community and promote sports as a tool for social change, advocate on behalf of the youth sports community for resources and awareness, improve coordination between youth sports providers, gather best practices for youth sports, research and evaluate the impact of programming, and then offer training and technical assistance to those youth sports providers that we have here in Milwaukee.
Awesome. You guys have done a lot in these 2 years on top of the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's
exactly,
wonderful to hear. I'm next going to ask Beth Devine, who's the founding executive director of the Philadelphia Youth Sports Collaborative. So Beth, you've been with the collaborative since its inception in 2016. Talk to us a little bit about your evolution over these past 5 years in terms of serving youth sports organizations in your community.
Sure. And thanks for having us here. We really appreciate being able to be here with our colleagues from across the country to talk a little bit about our work. When we started, we had a couple of advantages. One, we had a group of organizations who had existed as a collaborative in a different form for a few years. And then two, as Quinton talked about, when we reorganized as an intermediary, we already had a base and a group of interested people who not only right away became involved members, but also were responsible for creating the business plan for our work. So when I was hired, I was handed a 36-page document that said, okay, we've done this background, we've put all this together, we'd like you to implement it. And when we came together, I'll say that, Philadelphia really just had kind of a perfect storm of people. We had a new mayor who was very pro-child, pro-education, still is. We had some new life in Parks and Recreation. We had a new athletic director at the school district who understood sports-based youth development. So I would say our evolution started with the business plan. We built a membership, because I think first and foremost, you have to have the people that are doing the work, because that's where you learn what the needs are and what the direction is. And then our kind of second step was to, we created a task force on sports-based youth development, and we invited members from basically every youth-facing agency and entity to be part of that. So with 65 members, we came up with our recommendations in the Game On Philly report, and that became our blueprint for work. And so as we built those relationships with, our youth-facing city agencies, with the school district. After the task force, we were able to staff up. We secured a federal grant to do a little bit of direct service and research. And so now we're at 60 members. We have a staff of 5. And now our focus, now that we have all that work to stand on, is really driving advocacy and communications in the space while we provide all the services that we've been providing since the beginning to our member organizations. So it was definitely a progression, but I always say a lot of trains left the station at the same time. Some of them just went a little bit faster. And so now I feel like, we've really come together around this work and have a good base to be able to drive the conversation for more support for the important people that are doing the work on the ground.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing what you think where you've come in 5 years. So our final panelist today is Dasha Clark with Project Play Western New York. And Dasha, Project Play Western New York was founded after the release of the State of Play report for Western New York. But since that, you guys really have honed your focus based upon feedback from your stakeholders. So tell us who's in your network and what they're focused on.
So thank you first and foremost. I'm really excited to be in company with such great people. But just to explain, we're starting from the same point that you just referenced. The State of Play, when it was released for Western New York in 2018, was a wake-up call for our region to learn that only 16% of the youth across all 8 counties are participating in some type of physical activity for 1 hour was surprising for everyone. And that data actually brought several partners to the table. It brought a lot of stakeholders to want to engage in the work because 16% is never a number that you're comfortable with. So out of that, similar to in Milwaukee, we did community conversations. We didn't have such a great name for them. We just called them basic community conversations. But the conversations we had with stakeholders that were across all of the sectors, both private, public, several of our rec centers, as well as the municipalities, came and discussed what is the solution here. And the solutions that came out of those conversations pretty closely or directly tied to Aspen Project Play, your 8 plays. So out of those conversations, some of our focus areas or our game plan started with really focusing on free play and reintroducing that in our community, creating opportunities for sports sampling, ensuring that all of our coaches were trained with quality training. And then our 4th one, we like to say 3+1, because the last one is not one of the 8 plays, is capacity building. And what we saw was that several of our youth sport organizations are what we tend to call kitchen table organizations. The registration is done over the kitchen table. The fees are counted over the kitchen table. The scheduling for officials, everything is done at the kitchen table. And a lot of times that just doesn't give you a lot of capacity to build out to reach the entire community that you want to reach. So what our capacity building focus is on these organizations. How do we build their organizational strength? How do we give them the legs and the roots to grow strong? So out of those, when we created those working groups, we are based in Community Foundation for Greater Buffalo. So our work is always looking at collective impact model. So we are the backbone organization that is continually trying to promote this legacy. The Ralph C. Wilson Jr. Foundation's major legacy is improving quality of life. So when we looked at the quality of life of our youth, we're in dire straits. We definitely need to jump in and start doing things. Out of those groups, we were able to bring several different community stakeholders. And the fact that we honed the focus, interestingly enough, allowed us to expand our reach. So there are certain areas that local health insurances were very interested in. There were certain areas that business owners were very interested in. And they came in and joined the conversation, and everyone really wanted to make a difference. The other portion of our work is actually coming directly from the conversation of the communities that were impacted. So neighborhoods that have reached out to us were able to build strategy groups that really look specifically at their neighborhood or specifically at their sport, and how do we build initiatives within the areas of interest that continue to align with our original game plan, but has a very direct and specific impact. Lastly, our work is always about building new initiatives. How do we build something that is going to last? How do we build something that is going to be long beyond the starting point? And then how do we find the correct partners in the community to embed it so they can continue to grow it beyond Project Play's ability? Our focus points are always to enhance the quality of the organization or the programming for youth sports, increase the access to as many youth as possible. We're constantly trying to figure out how to move that needle. Starting at 16%, I think the original goal was 25%, but if anyone from youth sports or sports in general knows, you're always going for that 100. And then lastly, enhancing the sustainability of our organizations throughout our region. So I think I went a little bit beyond your original question, but hopefully that gave a pretty good idea of what Project Play West New York is about.
No, it's great. And I think it's really helpful. So I want to back up a little bit. And Quinton, I'm going to start with you because you mentioned something that I think I kind of want to dive a little deeper into, but that you serve both as an intermediary and backbone organization. And so in a lot of ways, you have both members that are part of your organization, and you have a broader coalition of folks that you're working with. So can you talk to us a little bit about who are the members of MISA, and then who are the people that are part of that broader coalition that are essential to your work?
So firstly, who are the members? For the most part, is youth sports providers here in Milwaukee, or community-based organizations. That's what our membership base looks like. So in addition to those, larger organizations, we've got mentors that are part of that, but then also coaches. But then who, as a larger group, is involved in that? We've got the health system, we've got higher education, we've got law enforcement, all agencies. I like to tell everyone, when you ask the question, who should be involved in this work, I like to say everyone. Everyone really needs to be at the table. Dasha mentioned it a little bit in her response, who came to the table, but everyone needs to be involved in that, regardless of whatever sector or industry that you might work in. Everyone has an important role to play. And so I'm always emphasizing to our members and those on our leadership team is the power of relationships and what they can essentially, get us. And so I often, encourage our leadership to go out and develop those relationships before you essentially need them. Because you never know what type of relationships may be beneficial to the work that you have, but then also bringing everybody to the table. And so I'm gonna tell a quick story here. So I'm always telling stories, or I'm doing something when I'm talking to people. And so someone once asked me a few years ago, like, how I would describe beauty. And the response to me was to quote an Italian painter. And the quote from the Italian painter was that beauty is a summation of parts, all working together in such a way that nothing needed to be added or taken away or altered. And so that's how I look at, and that's how I view the work that we do here at MISA. Everyone working together collectively, adding to the picture or to the vision for our youth here in Milwaukee. I've never mentioned this to my staff or my colleagues or whatnot, but it's the reason that I start every email or every meeting with the greeting, hello, beautiful people. And so I'm pretty sure they probably just thought I was weird this whole time, but there is a reason why I do that. So everyone needs to be at the table.
Well, I hope they're tuning in and they heard that, because I think that it's an amazing reason to start your emails that way. And I think it's, really essential to understanding this idea that a coalition isn't just a collective of people, but it's a collective of people working towards a common goal. And so, I want to throw that question to others on the panel as well. And who do you think is the most essential person of your coalition, in your coalition, who you didn't necessarily expect to need at the table when you started in this work? Beth, do you want to take that one first?
We had such a long list of people and agencies that we wanted to get involved, that I don't think anyone has really jumped out and surprised us. I think we've been supported and kind of ushered along by certain people who we maybe didn't set out to align with. But I think that we had a pretty clear picture that we knew we had to get involved with the school district, with the Department of Health, the newly formed Office of Children and Families, Parks and Rec, like all the obvious came forward and said, yes, let's work together. I think the surprises, if anything, was how quickly they turned to us to support various pieces of work. We were establishing ourselves and kind of getting to know the different agencies, but to Quinton's point and everybody's point so far is, that's really just about relationship building. And that's what backbones need to do. I think what's unique about our cities is we have a backbone organization. And I know that there's going to be groups out there that don't necessarily have that driver, but coalitions can still form and can be, brought forth in various forms. And so I think that the more relationships you build with anybody is going to open doors to people that might surprise you.
I think
go ahead, Dasha.
In our work, there has been constant small surprises. There isn't one sector that was surprising, but we were consistently surprised to find out, this council member used to play tennis and now they're really invested in it. Or this professor at one of the local colleges who isn't even involved in sports, they're completely involved in law or something like that. They think that they know that sports is big for mental health, so they really want to push for a mental health strategy group. I think there's been a lot of small surprises that were very pleasant. As a form of criticism to myself and my team, I think one of our biggest surprises is trying to engage youth directly into our stakeholder groups. It has been probably our most challenging to make sure that their voice is always prevalent, because they're not always as seasoned at making their voices heard amongst a group of strong-willed individuals. So really building that into our basis is important. But mentioning what Beth said, there wasn't a big surprise that I never thought that this would be a good partner, but there are several individuals that we didn't realize we can tap into that were in sectors that we weren't previously connected with. There's like local grocery stores that have been huge proponents of our events that you wouldn't immediately think that, but then wait, we're talking about health and wellness. Of course, it's a connection. Realizing those connectors and those lines that cross has been a major building point for collaboration for all of our working groups have been able to find connectors that you would not originally see at face value. But when you start diving into the purpose of these working groups and the purpose of these initiatives, you start realizing there's a lot of people invested in the same work, and we just need to figure out how to cross paths and build together.
So I'm going to jump in here and I'm going to make a little plug for Project Play, which I know all of you know very well and believe the same way that we do. But our first play is ask kids what they want. And every time that we work with communities or that we help coach and advise communities, we really strongly encourage them to do that. I mentioned our teamwork toolkit earlier. Through that, we have a great online youth survey tool that allows you to go to kids to gather information, to find out what sports they want to play, why they're playing sports, why they're not playing sports, what their relationship is with adults in the context of sports. And I know lots of other folks have been doing that type of work in terms of qualitative and quantitative data collection to hear from young people, even when we can't get them to our 7 p.m. or 8 p.m. meetings with folks. We know that their voices and their desires and wants are interwoven in between. I want to kind of pivot to talk about some of these data points that are really effective in bringing people together. One thing that we found from our survey research with young people in particular is that the top reason that they play sports is typically psychosocial reasons. They want to be with their friends. They're looking for opportunities to be active. It's less about competition and winning, but really about that opportunity to be a part of community. And Dasha, you mentioned the 16% of kids in your community that were, hitting the physical activity target, and that really being a rallying cry. What other data points have been really essential in bringing people together? And I'm going to start with Dasha and move to everyone on the panel for this one.
So of course that one was our main, as you mentioned, the rallying cry. But looking also when we break down that information to the 14% of young ladies who are participating, there are several organizations who are very invested in how do we move that needle. I think our constant discussion is more athletes, not so much better athletes, and how do we move the needle of engaging more communities. Looking at some of our rural communities, and one of our rural counties, less than 50% of the youth have access to free play spaces. So trying to figure out how to create access points has been a major discussion. And some of our larger partnerships with more of our national organizations have really focused on some of those. So those The jarring, unfortunately, the most jarring percentages are the ones that consistently have been the hallmarks or the cornerstones that bring everyone to the table in order to get the discussion moving forward, because everyone agrees, okay, this can't stay the way that it is. We need to change that. And the great thing about it is the curb cut effect of, if we create solutions that are very impactful for some of our most marginalized communities, we will actually create solutions that will impact the entire community. So understanding that and building towards those really cross regional solutions has built our entire collaboration process.
Ben, I'm going to go to you next.
Yeah, I mean, so I think the message or the data points that we've used the most is starting with the question of what is the purpose of sport? And if you ask that question across anybody, all of us that are on this call today, government officials, AAU teams, the purpose of sport is for kids to get engaged and have fun. And yet that's not what our sports system represents. We have a system where 70% of kids drop out of sport by the time they're 13. The percentages are higher for girls, higher for young people with disabilities, higher for young people of color, higher for young people of lower socioeconomic status. And yet this youth sports industry is more than a $20 billion industry. So like, we start by the system of something is not aligning between the values that we speak about as a society and then the system as it's actually set up. Even Jennifer, behind your head, I see 70% of coaches haven't received training, right? So it's also a system that's not regulated. There's very little government regulation over how youth sports is run, whether coaches, for example, have a sex offender check done on them before they coach, maybe if the school requires it, but there's not a regulation for coaches themselves. And so I think we look at the totality of the system, we see that it's failing kids, and then we ask ourselves, like, and use the data points of how effective can sport be as a tool for social change. We just put out a report, Lori's just put out a report a couple of months ago in partnership with Hello Insight that compares the social emotional growth of young people who participate in sports programs against young people who participate in general after school programs. And young people grow at significantly higher rates when they're participating in sports. Like, we all know this, we all have personal experience in it, and yet sport gets overlooked and we assume that every sport program is operating to make money or is operating in kind of a different system. And so, you know, I think those messages and those data points of saying like something is not aligning, we need to think about how to change this system. And we need to do that in collaborative ways that drive funding, awareness, research towards the programs that are doing it right, is the way that we've driven things forward in Chicago. And the very last thing I'll say is all of that becomes 10 times more relevant in the midst of COVID. Right. So we just ran an entire campaign in Chicago about how every inequity that existed in sport before 2 years ago has been amplified, and how, you know, there's so much more urgency now than there was even then.
Beth, I'm going to have you take that question next.
Yeah, and I think I want to take it down to the member organization level, because data is a challenge for small organizations. So from that standpoint, you know, one of the things that we did early on was brought in researchers to talk to our member organizations about what you measure and why, because you have to measure something or else you can't prove your work to the funders. You know, it's as simple as that. And so what we found was that a lot of people were measuring just to measure and not putting a lot of thought about what their inputs were. And so we hope that we provided enough guidance and education there. And what we saw happen in Philadelphia was a lot of the nonprofit sector was struggling with that point. So a lot of funders came together to provide guidance and support in the area of data collection and outcome measurement. As an organization from our space, you know, we partnered with Hello Insight too, because the one thing that we see is no matter how you deliver sport, SEL is impacted. So you might have an organization that focuses a whole lot on academic supports or nutritional supports or grit or, you know, leadership or community outreach. And but across the board, social emotional learning is impacted because of the nature of sport to build relationships with coaches and teammates. And so so we decided to invest in that tool to provide that to our member organizations and the training that goes with it, so that they could measure that. And then we as an organization could use that information to kind of rally the troops for the member organizations. And I know a number of our organizations were included in that Laureus study, and that's just another way that we as collaboratives can work together to kind of prove the impact of the work, so that we can all tell the story. It comes down to, how do you tell your story, and how do you show the importance of this work and make the case for it? So I think the more we do that, the more we can kind of work against the system that isn't working for our kids.
Quinton, I'm going to ask you to take that question maybe in a slightly different direction, because one of the things that we heard from Ben and Beth in particular was the importance of social emotional learning. And you mentioned that social emotional learning training was one of the initial strategies that brought together the MISA group, something that was really important. So can you just tell us a little bit about that and some of the progress that you've had to date in that space?
Sure. I feel like we're doing a Hello Insight commercial right now, because I was going to reference Hello Insight as well. It's a fantastic tool that I think everyone should adopt. But as Ben mentioned, the report that was put out by Laureus earlier this year that talked about Hello Insight and the social emotional learning platform that they have, and how, Beth said, this can essentially drive the work that we do. To Beth's point about bringing it down to the organizational level, I'm gonna get to your question in a second, Jennifer. But to Beth's point about getting it down to the organizational level, we thought about that as well. Often youth sports providers are measuring different things. They don't often necessarily think hard and long as to why they measure these things. Most of the time, what happens is what we measure is determined by who our funders are. So our funders will determine, like, all right, we want you to focus on this. We want you to focus on this. That might not be the things that essentially move the needle. And that's unfortunate. And, Ben talked about the system not working. That's part of the system that's not working, is making sure that our funders are on board to understand, like, what data points and measurements we need to be measuring to make sure that we're moving the needle and we're being effective in this space. All right, Jennifer, question again.
One of the reasons that you guys came together was the need for training of coaches in social emotional learning. That was a need that had been identified, and so hoping you could tell us a little bit about the progress to date.
Yep. So often people who work in the youth sports sector aren't individuals that this is something that's in addition to what they do during the day. So it's a pastime, it's a passion, or it's an interest that they have. Maybe their kids are involved in it. So often those individuals aren't trained as we would like them to be. And what we do here in Milwaukee, and I'm sure other cities as well, is we have the understanding that, if we don't have the training and we don't have the foundation or knowledge behind us when we're working with youth, we could essentially be doing more damage than good. We might have good intentions to go out there and do great things with these youth in the space, but if we don't have that training and that understanding, like the social emotional learning aspect, we are not effectively working with the youth as we should. And so adding that additional layer of education in there, that SEL allows us to better impact the youth, and that helps our outcomes and whatnot.
Yeah, and I would be remiss to say, Project Play couldn't agree with you more. And one of the things that we've been focused on in the past couple of years is really providing resources for all types of organizations, for intermediary organizations, for coalitions, for coaches themselves and providers, that are just the really basics of understanding what it means to coach a kid. So we've got our howtocoachkids.org course that I know a lot of you guys encourage people to take, which is just the 101 of being a youth sports coach. And then our calls for coaches, which are tools for coaches that are just reminders of daily actions or activities that you can do as a youth sport coach that center social emotional learning at the center of this. And I want to ask you guys, there are some topics that seem to always come up in the youth sports space, youth coaching or training of coaches, being one of those. And so I'm curious, in your own work, what are some of the activities that you continue to revisit because the need just constantly exists? Ben, I'm going to have you take that one first and then go to you, Dasha.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll build on what you just said. I think coach training and how do we define a trained coach continues to come up and evolve and be refined. Like, so even when we talk about training for social emotional learning, especially within the context of the last 2 years, something that we've come to learn is that it's hard to even train people or unlock social emotional skills if you don't first deal with the trauma and heal, which is something that all of our organizations do a lot of trainings on. There's a great organization called the Center for Healing and Justice Through Sport that I think does trainings for all of our organizations in this area. And so we refine that training. We also think about how do young people develop as they become adults. So young people that are in programs, they move up, they might become coaches, they might want to then become development staff or executive directors of the organizations. And so we also run trainings to teach fundraising skills and technical skills that can allow them to do that. So I think training is one topic. I think the other thing that always comes up for us that's more external facing, and I touched on it, but how do we get people, how do we get government, professional sports teams, funders to understand the power that sport has? I think we, all of our coalitions and the organizations within them look across our landscape, and there are very few funders that fund sport directly. They fund it from the side. They might fund education, and if you can supply the GPA data, then maybe you can squeeze into their funding category. And this is changing. We've evolved in this, but I've seen a lot of foundation websites that say we fund youth development, and then they have an asterisk under it that say, but we don't fund sports programs. And there's this mindset that sport is not youth development. And we have had to do a lot of evangelizing and persuading of all of these groups. And the how we do that, I think, continues to come up within our coalition of what are the right messages to use, as we talked about earlier. And how do we break through and build relationships with these groups to help share some of our data and our collective work.
So I think much of what Ben is talking about, we experience it similarly. To start, some of a trend that we are consistently talking about is the role of parents. At the base level, a lot of times the conversation is like that. The different stories you hear, the headlines of negative experiences at sports fields or on the court or outside in the parking lot, and trying to reframe that conversation. A lot of our focus is about changing the conversation of youth sports landscape. So changing even the terms that we use. When we started talking about training all coaches, the immediate backlash was that all our coaches said, we are trained. We know how to play it. We know how to coach our sports. We don't need additional training. So we have changed our language. We talk about supporting all coaches, supporting how they're going to support their athletes in regards to their socio-emotional learning. That small change of word immediately opened up certain doors and opened up certain minds to listening to the conversation that we were trying to engage in. And similarly with parents, both how we engage with parents from Project Play Western New York, as well as how do we connect parents to the coaches. We are starting to rephrase it as our post-game coach. So when they leave the court, when they leave the field, this is the coaches you're handing them off to go home with. So don't you want to make sure your coach is really, really well versed in what you just talked about? Rather than seeing them as your adversary, you start seeing them as your extended learning experience. So that has been an ongoing conversation of how do we reframe this in order to build a cohesive team within the community? Because that is our main focus, is creating a youth sports community. Stop having it so siloed between the coaches are a group, and then the athletes are a group, and the parents are a group, and no one will ever talk to each other. We had to change that and break down those walls. Additionally, like Ben said, there's very few funders who are specifically looking to fund youth sports. We are uniquely positioned in regards to that aspect, but beyond us, it's really having the conversation of what is sports? What is youth sports? What is significance? What is it meaning? Trying to really press the why and not just the how of what we do. The how is all of the collective impact and all of the stakeholders, but then there's the conversation of the why. Why is this even important? So trying to make that part of the ongoing discussion, I feel like I think 60% of my year is spent in one-on-one meetings with people, making sure they understand the why of Project Play Western New York. But helping them to understand the why is how we bring them to the table. Helping them to understand the why is how we're able to create more funding opportunities for the organizations that we're working with, because a lot of times they don't understand that we talked about this a lot internally during the pandemic, is that they see it as like the cherry on top. Like if I, after my entire meal and then we get to the dessert, and when we finish the entire Sunday, we can add sports at the end. And so sports is the first thing that gets pulled off as soon as there's any resources that decrease, but start seeing it as as the butter. You can't start the meal without it. But really seeing it as something that is embedded in the experience for youth. The experience of youth sports brings too much to their livelihood, to their existence, for it to be immediately removed as soon as there's a decrease in funding. So trying to understand how to look at it from the outside. I think everyone on this grew up in sports, so we automatically see it. But I try to look at it as someone who never played sports. How would they see it, and how do I make it real for them? And that tends to be the conversation to try and advocate on behalf of the organizations that we're connected to.
So Dasha, I have to say, I love the strategy of viewing families or parents and guardians as the post-game coach. I have to admit, there are most days that I feel like the referee more than the coach, but maybe I'll try and work on that role. But I do have a few more questions for the panel, but I'm going to jump in here with a question from our audience, just as a reminder to our audience to submit your questions in the Q&A integration in your Slido. But this is a question from Nate B. And Beth, I'm going to have you take it first, and then Quinton, you next. Every organization and administrator has responsibilities for their own mission, tasks, goals, and targets. Do you have strategies that have worked in convincing organizations to get outside that comfortable self-focused box and unify to seek shared goals or targets? And do you have any examples of success from your community?
Yeah, so I think that what's really important as coalitions are being built is to listen and understand what the needs of the potential member organizations are, and then provide services that support those needs. And then it's not necessarily stepping out of the box to unify. I mean, I think it's more we want to rally around and learn from the other organizations in our city and share learning and share ideas so that we can all, tweak our programs and get a little bit better. And then the other opportunity that I think that's provided in that is just the networking that can turn into additional success. Two examples is one organization in our city was looking to kind of grow their footprint. But as you know, getting a new location up and running is expensive and can be challenging. And the growth patterns aren't always just pick more schools and go into more schools, so we introduce them to other member organizations that work with the similar student, like the age and the type of sport. And what they did was they brought their trainers into those locations and doubled their footprint by working with organizations that already had the kids and had a need for that service. We also saw that happen with an organization that had a really robust boys program, but not a super robust girls program. And we think a lot of that comes in people offering co-ed programs and that sort of thing. And we know that girls kind of need their own space. And so we partnered them with a girls serving organization and said, why don't you learn from this girls serving organization how to get things up and running and how to recruit coaches and people to support work with girls, and within a month had a waiting list, so I think sometimes it's not necessarily asking people to do anything different. It's just, what do you do and how do we support that? But I will say one thing about kind of shared goals, and we actually worked with our members early on to determine a set of beliefs and practice standards, because we wanted to know what the non-negotiables were from the organization. So if you're going to be a good sports-based youth development organization, what absolutely has to be in place? And once we develop those beliefs and practice standards, now our job is to support all those standards. so that if an organization is a budding organization in the infancy stage, they can work towards accomplishing everything on the standards list with our help and support and the training services and opportunities that we provide. So I think it's less about changing or stepping out of a comfortable space and more about being open to work together and then seeing the value in that, because we can then take all that information and all their work and elevate it by telling their story on a different platform that maybe they wouldn't have access to.
Quinton, and how about you? I mean, how are you building that kind of shared understanding, shared set of goals amongst organizations in your network?
So thank you for the question. That I think it was Nate who submitted it. Awesome. This question comes up often, and about 6 years ago, I got to the point where I was a little bit frustrated with the fact that, we've got organizations that all have different focuses and missions and whatnot, which is great for their organization. But as a city, we need to be on the same team, regardless of whatever our mission and whatnot or focus for our organization is. And so about 6 years ago, I changed the tagline of my organization that I worked at prior to MISA to One Dream, One Team, essentially out of frustration, understanding that, we operate in these silos, we operate in these bubbles. We're not operating as one team. We need to get on the same page because we ultimately have the same dream of seeing our city, our community, our youth do well. And so we are not out to change anyone's mission or focus. Beth talked about the power of relationships and bringing people together and utilizing the resources and leveraging those resources to help amplify what everyone is doing. And what often happens in spaces is that we duplicate services. We duplicate services between organizations, and I feel like we don't ever really move the needle like we could if we all worked together and got on the same page and had that understanding. And Dasha talked about understanding your why. So I think, bringing all organizations together and having that foundation of why we're doing the work helps move organizations along and allows them to collaborate together.
Yeah, that's awesome. So I want to pose another question for the audience. I didn't cut you off, did I?
No, we're good.
No. Okay, good.
I can't keep going.
I want to pose another question from the audience, which is a really interesting question. This one comes from Carolyn. And Ben, I'm going to have you take this one first. What sports institutional gatekeepers or gatekeeping systems have posed challenges to alignment or coordination within the communities? And can you recommend some approaches to address them?
Yeah, this is a tough question, isn't it? I think so. I think we all exist kind of as a counterbalance to some of these gatekeeping systems, and really what they are. The gatekeeping systems are oftentimes top-down approaches, whether it comes from government or foundations or funders or corporations who have their own agenda that they're trying to drive that often changes as a new mayor is elected or as the world changes and a corporation might change their giving priorities. And that constant change sitting alongside a top-down approach means that organizations who are often strapped for funding and often trying to catch up with the priorities that are set can never do so. And so I think our organizations exist to try to flip that script, to try to create power through a collaborative and a community of organizations who can set their own agenda and can try to, it's not a coalition versus government thing. It's how do we set our own agenda and then have more of a conversation about alignment as other priorities and agendas are set. I think to name another gatekeeping system, I think that corporations, governments, foundations, they need to fund more collaboratively. And so if there are two competing corporations, they should both be able to fund the same organization. There shouldn't be exclusivity involved if we're all working towards the same goal of young people helping kids. And then I think Carolyn asked another question alongside it. She said, ask this one first, and then the second one, which is then how do we find funding for these long-term solutions despite some of these challenges? And, I kind of touched on this, but I think we can create power. And then I ultimately think, and this is something all of us are working towards because we meet regularly, we have to bring this message to government. There is so much government funding, especially right now through the American Rescue Plan. And government would have an interest in the kind of, funding and regulation of a community solution through sport. We're actually doing that in Chicago right now. Over the last 6 months, we've developed a community campaign called Chicago's Comeback, and just brought on a lobbyist that we're working with through the end of May to try to lobby for a $5 million line item out of the state budget to go to organizations that are meeting certain quality standards, as well as resources to train coaches, do research, and add capacity to existing organizations. So that's, if I'm looking at my long-term goal, it's to try to shift to some of that government funding.
Can I jump in real quick?
Please.
Beth mentioned that everyone can't have like the coalitions like we have. We have major alliances in our city. But collaboration still is an attainable goal. And I do think that is a big step towards getting past those gatekeeping systems. A lot of times the reason why you can't get past a system because you're an organization by yourself. And so your voice only resounds so much. Piggybacking off of Quinton with like old quotes and things that were told to me as a basketball player, it was always like, if I hit you with my pinky, it doesn't hurt that much, but if I close my fist, it has a much more impact. So if you close your fist with the multiple organizations and come to those funders as a unit, even if it's not an 80 organization or 800 organization unit, even if it's just a couple, you're able to create a larger message. And it also encourages them to fund these opportunities. A lot of my conversations with some of our organizations is, how do we build this into a more fundable opportunity? How do we build this into something that people want to get engaged in? And a lot of that has to do with the idea, from a funder standpoint, how is it that my whatever amount of dollars will impact as many lives as possible? And that's what they're always wondering. So when it's just going to one organization, they're not as willing. When we're asking from everyone who's on this call, we're asking on behalf of several organizations, so we get a little bit of more give or leeway. But from just your standpoint, building with local organizations that may not be doing the exact same thing as you, as Beth mentioned, sometimes partnering with a mentoring program or partnering with an educational program and then coming with a different ask, will ease open some of those doors to get some of the conversation flowing freely and allow you to get a little bit more support in areas where you weren't receiving it.
So there's been some other great questions that have come in, but I want to be mindful of time here. And I have one final question that I want to ask the panel. But for folks that did not get their questions asked today, I want to strongly encourage you to sign up for tomorrow's post-summit workshop hosted by the Movement for Sport Equity. Oh, that's a mouthful. The link is in the chat, in the ideas function. And this will allow you to reflect on the learnings from today's summit, but engage in discussion and action planning with others in your community. So to our panel, before we go in the kind of final remaining minutes here, what does success look like 5 or 10 years from now? Beth, what's success going to be in Philadelphia?
I think success in Philadelphia is going to be the collaborative aligned with an official office of the city, with city funding, state funding committed to the effort of making sure that every available space is programmed with an opportunity for youth sport to happen in the way that we do it. And we're working towards that, and I'm hopeful, and I think that success is that this carries on beyond us, beyond whoever's in my chair, beyond whoever's in the mayor's seat, beyond whoever's at the school district, that this work is organized and set with a funding stream so that it continues past us. I think that's success.
Ben, how about Chicago?
Yeah, I mean, I think to start, I guess the more people have access to sport and specifically high quality sport. And so, as sub bullets of that, more coaches are trained, that there are basic standards in sport, that there's development focused curriculum, for those programs. I think success is increased funding and awareness. So success is those asterisks that exist on foundations' websites that we don't fund sports start to disappear more and more, which is already happening. That government recognizes the role of sport and creates individual funding categories for it. And then I think the last thing I'll say is increased cross-sector and increased collaboration between organizations within the sector and outside of the sector. And so, I want to see the Office for Violence Prevention in Chicago come to these organizations to learn what they're doing and to share what their priorities are as a city. So I think I would like to see more and more collaboration and communication between our collaborative and city agencies.
Quinton, how about Milwaukee?
So funding and advocacy would be our top thing for what success looks like. A sustainability plan, access to sports for all youth, training at least 300 coaches here in social emotional learning and trauma-informed care, and then also starting a sustainability and like a succession plan. What often happens in government or corporations or nonprofits is people who are in positions of power hold those positions of power for a very long time. And that's unfortunate. And they are the gatekeepers essentially to the work that we want to get done. And so having a succession plan for some of these corporations to be able to bring in new ideas and have diversity of thought for how they plan to spend their funding and whatnot at the corporation level, C-suite level, within our government, but then also in, like the nonprofit sector, making sure that we have individuals who are going to move the work and not be, kind of in the way.
And last but definitely not least, Dasha, what about Western New York?
From a qualitative standpoint, really looking at the conversation, our focus is really changing the conversation that is existing around youth sports, looking at how are we really creating healthier kids, happier families, and stronger communities as a result of youth sports. The work that's being incubated right now at Project Play, have we successfully embedded that with our community partners, and are they living that on with quality? From a quantitative standpoint, did we move the needle? If we do an updated state of play, what is that percentage of youth that are active? And then also, if our quality has increased, if our access has been opened up, and if our sustainability has been enhanced, we should see increased participation, like I just said, but also a high increase in retention. Families should want to keep coming back to the same organizations to receive that same experience over and over again, generation after generation.
Well, that's great. And you guys couldn't have set up the Project Play finale any better, where we have a number of sessions featuring not just the Children's Bill of Rights in sports, but strategies to increase funding, strategies to engage government, both in terms of oversight and advocacy, supporting coaches, and supporting mental health. So don't forget to tune in at as.pn/PP Summit 2021. And finally, don't forget to register for next year's Project Play Summit, which will be in person in Washington, D.C. on March 9th. The registration is as.pn/PP Summit 22. I want to thank our panelists today. This was an awesome conversation and look forward to continued conversation tomorrow in the post-summit workshop. We will see you online shortly for the finale, and we hope to see you next year in Washington, D.C. Thanks again.